won't change, but just wanted to confirm, that at least from our information, that July 1st is still the date that the new rules are going to go into effect. Okay, the four rules, that sort of affect our product and the areas that we're going to provide information for you. The 34-hour reset limitation, just, briefly, what are the changes there? Now the required rest break, how does that impact the product? The change in on-duty definition is the language that the FMCSA used. You're going to hear us throughout the presentation, and because that rule is about riding in the passenger seat as part of a team, we refer to that as the passenger rule. So that's just our nomenclature for that rule. And then the last one, which, I'm only going to... Okay, so first we'll talk a little bit about the 34-hour reset. So the graphic, that you see now is, previous, or in this case, where you are operating today. The current rule, you can take a 34-hour off-duty period, start anytime, end anytime, and do it as often as you like, and every time you do it, you're getting a reset of your weekly clock. So then with the change, they're applying limitations to the rule. And the limitations are you have to have 2 consecutive 1 to 5 a.m. periods, and it can only be taken once per week. So in the graphic on the bottom here, what we're trying to illustrate is just talking about the impact to the 1 to 5 a.m. change. What does the 1 to 5 a.m. change mean, and how does that impact the driver? So in the example here, this driver started taking his 34-hour off-duty at midnight on Monday, and therefore Tuesday at 10 a.m. they're able to achieve the reset. So whereas before you could start the reset anytime, now you can see here in the graphic that the reset has to overlap and cover or contain 2 periods from 1 to 5 a.m. So what happens with the 1 to 5 a.m. is that you need to be careful. Sometimes you can't control it, but from an understanding, you can't always control when the driver stops working or, when they start working. So as far as when I start my 34-hour off-duty period, you don't have a lot of control sometimes. But from understanding of the rule, the graphic here is trying to show you the previous example that we showed. But in this case, the driver didn't quite get off-duty at 12 a.m., and they actually went off-duty between the 1 to 5 a.m. period. And because of that, they don't include 2 periods until Wednesday at 5 a.m. So if depending on what time 1 to 5 a.m. you started, it could be, 50-plus hours that the driver actually had to be off-duty in order to achieve a reset. So, like I said, it doesn't mean that you can always control when the driver goes off, but they just need to be aware that when they do go off, especially during the 1 to 5 a.m. period, that's the period that's going to, in a sense, require or penalize them the most as far as time they have to stay off. So what this kind of means is that under the weekly rule today, every day at midnight, you're gaining back hours, right? So what might happen is when you get into a scenario where you can't control where the driver goes off duty, it may be beneficial for the driver to look at the time that they're going to gain back at midnight tonight, at midnight tomorrow night, and kind of look forward and just use the weekly rule and continue working versus waiting for a reset. Whereas under the current rules, you just would take the reset typically because you only have to take 34 off versus now if your question is, should I wait 50 hours versus start working right away, you might prefer to just not take the reset now. So there's some weekly sort of work planning there that depending on where the driver stops, you could have some challenges. The way we kind of have set it from a training perspective to help explain to the drivers what's the optimal way to look at this rule is that there's an optimal or a sweet spot from 7 p.m. on any given day until 1 a.m. the following morning, that as long as you start your reset with between 7 p.m. to 1 a.m., you're only going to have to take 34 hours off to get a reset. If you start your reset anytime outside of 7 p.m. to 1 a.m., you're probably going to have to take more than 34 hours. So just from a training perspective, if you lay this out on a timeline like we have here, and and show the driver starting at various times, I think, you'll see how that 7 p.m. to 1 a.m. applies. So the other limitation is the 168-hour limitation, or once a week. So same graphic, same situation. Driver goes off at midnight on Monday. Tuesday at 10 a.m. they achieve a reset. And what the limitation says is that you cannot start your next reset until 168 hours from the time you started your last one. So in this case, we completed our reset at 10 a.m., but that reset started Monday at 12 a.m., so the driver will not be able to take a reset or start another reset until the following Monday at 12 a.m. So as we get into the product stuff, I think Melissa will cover, some of the scenarios that get more complicated. Like, it doesn't mean that between Monday this week and Monday next week that the driver might not be off for over 34 hours. But even if they are, they won't be eligible for the reset because they can only do it once a week. So that's kind of the significance of the change there, is that any time you had a reset in the past, you would just reset, and now you're required to wait. So that's kind of just the high level on the reset. Rest break, kind of a simple rule, but nonetheless, some things to think about. So the way the rest break is treated for us is the rule, obviously, every 8 hours of work, driver needs to take 30 minutes of off-duty time prior to driving. So the subtlety there is, it doesn't mean that if you work 8 hours, you have to immediately take a break. It just means, like the other rules, that you need to take a break prior to driving. So today, if you have the 14-hour rule and you're working hard and you're getting to the point where you're reaching the 14-hour limit and you're on duty, then you go over 14 hours and now you've worked 15. And then you end your day. There's no violation of the 14-hour rule because there was no driving after the 14th hour. The way the rest break is treated is the same way. We're gonna help you understand when your 8 hours is up and help you be compliant with taking your breaks, but you're not going to get a violation of the rest break requirement unless the driver actually drives without taking a break. So they just have to make sure that if they're working longer than 8 hours, that after the 8th hour, there's no driving unless there's a 30-minute break. The other note is just there's a hazardous component to this break rule. Due to the hazmat regulations, those drivers need to stay in attendance of the vehicle when they're carrying hazmat. So what they've said is, if I'm carrying hazmat, can I take a break and be off duty? And the way they've interpreted it to say is, no, we still want you to be on duty. As long as you're performing no other duty activities, you can take a break while in attendance of the vehicle and be on duty. So in other words, they can record their break as on-duty time. They just need to explicitly say on their log when they're taking that on-duty break. So just a little example we wanted to kind of show you from a planning or training standpoint, even though it seems very simple, the rule, which it is, on the top graphic, what we're showing is, for example, if you started out your day and sometime early in your long day, you had an opportunity to take a break, certainly you should take the break. We're not, discouraging you from doing that, but you can see that should you do that, then 8 hours from the completion of that break, you're going to have to take another break. So therefore, on the bottom example, you can see that this case where a driver has taken his break later on in the day and has only then been required to take one break per day. So from a operational impact, it's kind of a subtle part of the rule, but due to this rule, you're sort of losing 30 minutes from your 14-hour day of duty time as it stands. If you don't manage your day properly and take your break too early, then you're going to be forced to take another break, and in a sense, you end up losing an hour of duty time, in any particular day. So this graphic just try to give you a reminder, if you haven't already figured it out yourself, right, that, sometimes you might take a break and think you're getting it out of the way, basically, for the day, and in reality, you might be just forcing yourself to take another one before the day's over. Okay, then the final one, here's the rule and what the changes are to the mobile and the host related to each rule. So, Melissa?
Hi, thank you, Eric. All of the screens I'm going to show you during this demo are on the host and then the mobile will appear after July 1st. So what I'm going to show you is how it's going to look when July 1st comes and we've turned everything on, and when the 34 hours and the rest break rules are actually in effect. All of the data on the screens you're going to see in this demo are mocked up data taken from our test system and captured on an MCP 110. However, I want you to know that the changes I'm showing you will be available on all of the mobile platforms. I'm just using the 110 to demonstrate it here. All right, so let's first talk about what we did to support the 34-hour rule set. What you're looking at here is the mobile. When a driver takes the 34 hours off and meets all of the rule requirements that Eric mentioned, which is the 2 consecutive 1 to 5 a.m. segments and the 1 week requirement, then the system is going to automatically grant the 34-hour reset to the driver, as long as he meets the rules. The driver is going to see this on the mobile. As you can see, I've highlighted here on the status screen the 2 fields we're providing to give that information to the driver. The first is the last 34-hour reset. It shows the date and the time that the driver completed the last 34-hour reset. That's what that's showing. The field below that, next 34-hour start, that's showing the earliest a driver is eligible to start another 34-hour reset. So how do we calculate that? What we do is we subtract 34 hours from the last reset, that first field, and then we add 168 hours of time to it. In other words, we're calculating as 168 hours from the start of the last reset. So this start time is really the optimal time for a driver to start a 34-hour reset. Why is it optimal? It's because this is, if he takes it at this time, at this start time we've put here, it only takes 34 hours to complete the reset. It doesn't mean that we're saying the driver can't go off duty before this time or even after this time. We're just offering this time as the most optimal time based on the last reset.
So on the next 34-hour reset field, just kind of for you to have some clarity, because you might get questions, is if you just literally interpret the rule and say it's 168 hours from the start of the last one, it's a little bit different in this field. So think of it as we're going to give you the first legal time based on the rule, so it'll never be a non-compliant time, first legal time and the optimal time. In other words, when you only have to take 34 hours off. So like when we talked about the rule and starting between 7 p.m. and 1 a.m., anytime you start there, that's where you're going to end up. So no matter when you start, you can always start off duty earlier and be off for a longer period of time, but you don't get credit for it necessarily unless you meet the criteria. So if you're trying to do the math and figure out, how we came up with it, right, what you'll always see there is it isn't going to be 168 hours from the time you started your last restart. It's going to be 168 hours from the optimal time you ended your last one. So just so you know, it's something you might have to think about and work through a little bit. It sometimes isn't just apparent as to exactly what it is, but we're trying to coach the driver to say, if you only want to take 34 hours off, this is when you should start your next restart.
Okay, so that next 34-hour start time only shows a date and time until that time is actually reached. When it's reached, the field changes to display eligible now, which basically is telling the driver, you can start your 34-hour reset at any time. The driver still has to meet the requirement of between 1 and 5 a.m., like 2 of those 1 to 5 a.m. segments, but he's free to start that reset whenever he wants. So it'll just say eligible now. Okay, so when a driver has not taken a 34-hour reset in his current cycle, the last 34-hour reset is going to show no reset in current cycle. In other words, this is the last. What we're saying is that if the driver took a reset, but it wasn't recent enough to be in his current cycle, his current duty cycle, it's going to show that text. And if the driver has no 34-hour reset in the current duty cycle, then the driver is eligible to take a reset right away, which is why it says eligible now in the next start field. Okay, in addition to the 34-hour reset information on the status screen, we also are displaying hours to be gained information. The first field, hours to be gained, is already available on the status tab and tells the driver how many hours that driver is going to gain back to his clock at midnight based on the weekly rule. What we've added is a field below that called the hours gained in 2 days. So now we're giving the driver more information. We're telling him how many hours you're going to gain back on your clock at midnight tomorrow night based on the weekly rule. So this kind of information is going to help the driver figure out how many hours they're gaining back tonight, tomorrow night, and that's going to help them make decisions about whether they need to take a 34-hour reset.
So I just want to quickly make that point of it's not a training thing necessarily about the rule. I think it's more of an operational thing is why we added it. Is unfortunately it's going to be a complexity that you and your drivers are going to have to deal with this rule, right? Which is, like I said during the rules discussion, right? It isn't always that taking the 34-hour reset is your best option, and that if you evaluate these fields, it might even make sense at some point, for the driver to go to the 7 or 8 day tab and look at their hours for the past 7 or 8 days, rather than just the hours gained in 2 days, and really kind of look at what their week looks like to know what they're going to gain. And they might, basically go away from using a 34-hour reset altogether just because the way their work is, it doesn't make sense for them to wait to get the reset. So just something you have to think about, from a planning perspective.
Okay, so as mentioned before, when a driver takes 35 hours off and meets all of the rule requirements, the system's going to automatically grant the 34-hour reset to the driver. So since the new rule says that the drivers can only have one 34-hour reset per week, we've given the driver the ability to choose whether or not to keep that reset. So we've added this reject button you see here, and this gives the driver the ability to click it to reject a 34-hour reset that he's currently earned. If he clicks it, it's immediately removed from his logs, and then he becomes eligible to take a different 34-hour reset in the same current duty cycle. So if the driver knows within the same duty cycle, I'm going to take 34 hours more off, this gives him the choice to say which 34-hour off he wants to take in this duty cycle, since he only can take one per week. Now, as Eric mentioned, the hours to be gained information and that 7 or 8 day tab is, again, going to help those drivers figure out how many hours they're gaining back on the weekly rule. That might have some impact on deciding whether or not to take that 34-hour reset. I also want to mention here that if the driver rejects the reset, he clicks that button and rejects it, and decides not to use it, or if he approves his log and doesn't reject it, he can't change his mind and go back and edit the 34-hour reset information on the mobile. If he wants to make a change regarding the 34-hour reset after he's rejected it or after he's accepted his logs, he's going to have to contact the host administrator to make the edit on the host side. Okay, so that's what we've done for 34-hour reset. Now I want to switch to rest breaks. Let's talk about what we did to support our drivers and our host users for rest breaks. As Eric mentioned before, drivers need to take 30 minutes off every 8 hours of work time. However, they'll only go into violation if they haven't taken a break and they drive. So drivers now need to monitor this 8-hour clock. To help them, we've added this new rest break clock on the summary tab on the mobile. And it counts down 8 hours from when the driver logged in. Anytime a driver takes 30 minutes off, this clock is going to reset. So we've also added, you'll notice, highlighted the DOT clock. We've added that clock now considers the 8-hour rest break clock. So with this change, the DOT clock is never going to be greater than 8 hours because the 8-hour rest break clock is actually the shortest of all the clocks. However, drivers need to be aware it might not always, the DOT clock may not always be indicating how long until a rest break is required, even though it's the shortest clock. because another clock might actually be lower. Because the DOT clock still is always going to show the lowest of all the driver clocks. So with this in mind, you'll want to talk to your drivers because they're going to need to come back to this summary tab more often, I think, than they might do today. They're going to have to keep an eye on the actual 8-hour rest break clock and not just look at the DOT clock. Okay, for rest breaks, we've created some warnings to help the driver. And we're wanting to give them advice about what they need to do to stay compliant. One of the warnings we provide is when the driver is about to terminate an off-duty status prematurely and they have less than 2 hours left on that rest break clock. So you can see in this example, we're on the change status screen, and the driver's been off-duty for about 20 minutes. And in this case, the DOT clock showing 1 hour and 23 minutes. And let's say that actually is representing the rest break clock in this example. In this situation, when the driver tries to change to on, we're going to bring up this warning and tell them how many more minutes they need to stay in off-duty in order to complete their rest break. Now, there's two things I want to mention about this that you need to know. One is that the warning doesn't appear if there's more than 2 hours left on the rest break clock. The other is that the warning doesn't stop drivers from changing their status. It's just there to help give them information to help them make decisions that help them comply with that rest break rule. In addition to this warning, we're also going to provide alerts like we do for the other clocks. So at 60 minutes, 30 minutes, and 15 minutes prior to a rest break rule violation, the driver is going to get an alert. And of course, drivers are also going to get an alert when they're actually in a rest break violation. Okay, so what are we doing on the host? The rest break countdown clock is going to appear for each driver on the driver detail. A hazmat driver who's set up to take rest breaks while on duty is going to see the option to select rest break while on duty. You can see the little checkbox there underneath the on the change status screen. They just have to click that checkbox when they're taking a rest break on duty. When these drivers take the rest break on duty, that time's also going to appear on the graph tab on the mobile, and it's going to appear as a different pattern along the on-duty bar. This is really helpful too during a roadside inspection. The driver will be able to show the inspector, here's where I took my rest break on visually.